What if the most dangerous part of the legend of Atlantis isn't whether it was real? What if it's why it refuses to disappear? An entire an empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, advanced, wealthy, and dominant, and then just gone, swallowed in a single day and night. No confirmed ruins, no recovered artifacts. We can point to without argument, at least. So just a story that has survived longer than most empires ever did. And here's the unsettling part. Atlantis doesn't feel ancient. It feels familiar. Tonight we're not hunting for coordinates. We're asking a harder question. Why does this story feel like a warning? You didn't click this to hear another map theory. You clicked because the legend of Atlantis carries weight. It lingers, it nags at something. And right now, that weight feels heavier. We're living in a moment where systems feel strained, supply chains snap, financial markets swing wildly, infrastructure that once felt permanent suddenly looks super fragile. And in the middle of it all, a 2,300-year-old story about a powerful civilization collapsing overnight starts to hit differently. This episode isn't about proving Atlantis existed. It's not about dismissing it either, though. This is about understanding why the story still endures. By the end of this episode, you'll understand where the legend of Atlantis actually comes from, what Plato's Atlantis account really says, and why this myth continues to surface during moments when civilizations feel uncertain. That's the thread. Not treasure hunting and surely not fantasy. Meaning, because whether Atlantis was a physical place or not, the belief in it is real. The cultural gravity is real, and the obsession is real. And that makes it worthy of serious attention. And here's what we do know. The primary source for Atlantis is Plato. Around 360 BCE, in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, he describes a vast island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is people now call the Strait of Gibraltar. And according to Plato's Atlantis account, this empire was technologically advanced for its time, militarily dominant, and and morally corrupt. And then it fell in a single day and night of misfortune. So he says. That line has echoed for over 2 millennia. An empire that believed it was untouchable erased in less than 24 hours. That's not fantasy. That's vulnerability. Now, here's the contradiction. Most academic historians treat Atlantis as allegory, a political cautionary tale, a philosophical device. And that may be true. It might be. But here's the question that doesn't go away. If it was just a story, why does it feel like a memory? Why do ancient civilization collapse theories keep resurfacing in cycles? Why do we see similar cultural archetypes of destruction, across civilizations, floods, fire from the sky, golden ages ending abruptly. Why does Atlantis myth versus reality remain a live conversation instead of a closed case? Because the power of the legend of Atlantis isn't in the coordinates, it's in the collapse. High strangeness and ancient history often intersect at this exact point. Not because we want fantasy, but because we sense patterns. And if you're a curious skeptic, you're not looking to believe everything. You're looking for coherence and you're looking for depth without hysteria. So here's the information gap we're holding on to. If Atlantis was metaphor, why does it resonate during periods when our systems feel brittle? And if it was distorted memory, what kind of catastrophe leaves a cultural scar that deep? I don't know. So, folks, send this to a friend who says it's just a myth, but still feels uneasy when the when the grid flickers or the markets shake. And if you're a researcher, historian, or investigator working seriously in high strangeness and ancient history, I want to connect. Let's have rigorous conversations with without the extremes. Because this week, we're not chasing ruins, we're examining fragility. And we're just getting to the first layer. Section 1, the legend of Atlantis, where the story actually begins. So let's strip this back to bedrock. Before the documentaries, before the crystal power plant memes, before the underwater drone footage with dramatic music, okay? Where does the legend of Atlantis actually start? And for us, it starts with one man, Plato. And really, that's it. There are no Egyptian records we can independently verify, no Phoenician maps, no parallel Greek accounts describing a lost island empire. I mean, people always say, oh, the Library of Alexandria burnt down, blah, blah, blah. So, but either way, what we can prove is just Plato's Atlantis account, written around 360 BCE in 2 dialogues. That alone should give us pause. Not dismissal, just pause. Because Plato wasn't a historian in what we would consider the modern sense. Plato was a philosopher, a storyteller, a political thinker. And here's how he frames it. He claims the story came from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests. According to them, 9,000 years before Solon's time, there existed a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Powerful navy, had advanced engineering, massive concentric rings of land and water, bridges, temples, wealth beyond imagination, and then moral corruption, arrogance, expansionism, and divine judgment. In a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis sank beneath the sea. Now here's the micro scene. Picture an Athenian citizen sitting in a courtyard listening to this story for the first time. Athens itself had just survived wars, political upheavals, power struggles, and Plato tells them there was once an empire stronger than you, richer than you, more advanced than you, and it vanished overnight. That's not fantasy. That's a warning. Now, here's the contradiction. If Plato meant Atlantis purely as allegory, he went into extraordinary detail: geography, architecture, military strategy, political structure. Why so specific? Philosophers use metaphor all the time. They still do. But they don't usually design full city schematics unless they want the image to stick. And it stuck. Here's where this gets interesting. Plato describes Athens, his Athens, as a moral counterpoint to Atlantis. Small, virtuous, disciplined. Atlantis represents imperial excess. So academically, many argue this is a political philosophy wrapped in myth. Fair. This is fair. The deeper layer is, even if it is allegory, allegory works best when it resonates with something people already recognize. You don't invent collapse anxiety out of thin air. You tap into it. Now let me ask you something. Why did Plato choose a sudden catastrophe? Why not slow decline? Why not civil war or famine? Why totally annihilate this place in 24 hours? Because sudden destruction carries psychological force. It bypasses all debate. And it hits you right in the gut. The idea that everything stable can disappear in a day is way more terrifying than gradual decay. And that's where ancient civilization collapse theory, that's what we'll call it, start to creep in. Because historically, civilizations have collapsed, right? The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw entire empires destabilized in a relatively short window, as history goes. Trade networks failed and cities, they burnt down. Writing systems literally completely vanished. Not fantasy, history. Now, I'm not saying Atlantis equals the Bronze Age collapse. That would be freaking lazy of me. But I am saying this: human memory has experienced real systemic collapse before, multiple times. And Plato may have been drawing from cultural anxiety that was already embedded in Mediterranean history. So when we ask about Atlantis myth versus reality, maybe the wrong question is why was there a literal island? Maybe the better question is, what kind of world produces a story like this? A stable one or a fragile one? The tension we're going to carry forward, all right? If the legend of Atlantis was designed as a warning, why does it feel like it's speaking across centuries then? Why does it feel less like fiction and more like pattern recognition? We're not done with Plato, but next we have to step out of ancient Greece, because Atlantis didn't stay a philosophical footnote. It freaking mutated and it spread, and it became something far stranger. And that transformation might tell us more than the original story ever did. Section 2, the legend of Atlantis and how a philosophy lesson became a global obsession. Things get weird. For nearly 1,500 years after Plato, the legend of Atlantis barely moves the cultural needle. And a few mentions here and there, some philosophical debate, but nothing overly explosive. Then the Renaissance hits. Ancient texts get rediscovered, printing presses fire up, and suddenly Plato's Atlantis account is circulating widely again. And this time, people don't treat it like a metaphor. They treat it like a missing chapter of history. Let's pause there for a second. Why the shift? Because the Renaissance wasn't just about art and science, it was about rediscovery. It was about the belief that ancient knowledge had been lost. The Dark Ages, right? And could be recovered. That's fertile ground for Atlantis, things like Atlantis. Now, imagine being a European explorer in the 1500s. You're crossing the Atlantic Ocean for the first time. Entire continents appear that your civilization didn't even know existed. Civilizations in the Americas with massive stone structures, advanced agriculture, astronomical alignment, all kinds of stuff. You're standing in front of something your worldview just didn't account for. And suddenly the idea of a lost advanced civilization surely doesn't sound ridiculous. It absolutely sounds plausible. And when new worlds are discovered, old myths start feeling less like fiction and more like unfinished business. And here's where Atlantis myth versus reality takes a turn. By the 1800s, writers began placing Atlantis everywhere. I mean, freaking everywhere. The Caribbean, the Azores, Antarctica, the Sahara, okay? The Sahara Desert, which that's the Richat structure, but that's a whole nother episode. Then comes Ignatius Donnelly in 1882 with Atlantis, the antediluvian world. He argues Atlantis was the source civilization of all ancient cultures, Egypt, Mesoamerica, Europe. Now, historically, most of Donnelly's arguments don't hold up under modern scrutiny. Archaeology has advanced significantly since then, allegedly. But here's the thing. The obsession spreads anyway. Why? Because Donnelly tapped into something bigger than geography. He tapped into the fear of loss. The Industrial Revolution is accelerating. Cities are growing so fast. Technology is outpacing tradition, and still is. And people start wondering, what if progress isn't just linear? What if we've peaked before? Maybe. What if we've done this before and it just didn't end well? Now we're stepping into psychological layer, okay? The myth of Atlantis becomes less about maps and more about cultural archetypes of destruction. From last week's episode, flood myths exist across cultures. Showed that Mesopotamia, the Hebrew Bible, in indigenous traditions worldwide, this flood myth exists. And is it a myth though? I mean, we don't know. Whether literal or symbolic, the pattern is always consistent. Human flourishing, moral decay, catastrophic reset. That's not conspiracy. That's reoccurring narrative structure, bottom line. And this is where high strangeness and ancient history start brushing against each other, because some begin to speculate, was Atlantis a pre-Ice Age civilization destroyed by rising sea levels? Possibly. I mean, we know factually that sea levels rose dramatically after the Ice Age, roughly, 120 meters over thousands of years. So entire coastline settlements would now be underwater. And they found a whole bunch of them. Um, that's geological reality. But here's the caution. There is currently no verified archaeological evidence of a global advanced lost super civilization from 12,000 years ago. Speculation? Yes. Hard proof? No. And here's where intellectual agnosticism matters. You hear me use that phrase. You can acknowledge geological catastrophe without inventing crystal power grids. You can entertain possibility without endorsing fantasy. Now, let me ask you something. Why does the legend of Atlantis surge in popularity during times of instability? The late 1800s, post-World War eras, the Cold War, and right now, during a period where supply chains feel fragile and geopolitical tensions simmer I mean, we're at a war with Iran, and there's many other conflicts across the globe. That's not coincidence. Atlantis rises in our imagination when confidence falls in our systems. And that's not to say it didn't exist, but it becomes a mirror, a, a myth that reflects anxiety about collapse. I just wrote a book about a grid down situation, which actually comes out on Sunday. Today's Friday. This book comes out Sunday. So check it out. And here's the deeper tension with all of this. If Atlantis is just allegory, why does it reappear every time civilization feels brittle? If it's just fantasy, why does it feel like deja vu, man? Like imprinted in our DNA, deja vu. We're not done. Because the real weight of the legend of Atlantis isn't in Plato, and it isn't in Donnelly. It's in us. Section 3, the legend of Atlantis, why it won't let us go. Okay, let's stop chasing islands and let's talk about you and me. Because the reason the legend of Atlantis won't die isn't buried under the Atlantic Ocean, guys. It's wired into the human nervous system. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Civilizations feel permanent until they don't. Ask Rome, ask the Mayans, ask any culture that believed it was the center of the world. Sounds familiar. And this isn't drama. This is documented history. Entire systems have collapsed within a few generations. Trade networks fail, climate shifts, leadership fractures, external pressures just mount one on top of another. And from the inside, it never feels like the end. It feels like business as usual, right up until it's not. Collapse doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly, then moves fast. That's why the legend of Atlantis hits different during unstable periods, because it compresses that entire process into one terrifying image, a society that believes it's untouchable, gone overnight. Now let's separate fact from speculation clearly. Fact. Plato's Atlantis account describes moral corruption preceding collapse. Fact: many historical collapses show patterns of overextension, inequality, environmental strain, or geopolitical conflict. Now, speculation that Atlantis was a literal global superpower with lost technology beyond anything that we can imagine or know. That leap requires evidence we do not currently have. Sorry. I mean, there's bits and pieces of things, but but here's where the psychological why matters more than the archaeological what. Why are we so drawn to stories that suggest we've peaked before? Why does this idea of a lost golden age feel so freaking plausible? Here's one possibility: because modern modernity feels fragile, because supply chains run on precision timing. I mean, we've dealt with some of these issues recently, folks. Financial systems depend on digital confidence. Infrastructures assume stability. You flip a switch and expect light. You swipe a card and expect approval. You order something and expect delivery. Right now, that system works, and it works great. But if you zoom out historically, those systems fail over and over and over. And that tension creates space for myths like Atlantis to breathe. Atlantis isn't about sunken temples. It's about systematic arrogance. Now let's layer in something deeper. Across cultures, we see recurring cultural archetypes of destruction, flood narratives, fire from the sky, divine judgment, cyclical ages, right? Cyclical all the time. Whether you interpret those through a biblical lens or a geological catastrophe or psychological symbolism, it doesn't change the fact that the pattern is there. Humanity rises, humanity destabilizes itself, something resets the board. Boom. Over and over and over again. High strangeness and ancient history intersect right there. Because once you admit that catastrophe is possible, you start asking bigger questions. Have we misunderstood our own resilience? Or are we repeating patterns? Are we as advanced as we think we are? Or are we just better at hiding fragility? Scariest part of Atlantis isn't the water. It's the confidence. Now, the intellectual agnosticism piece, okay? There is no confirmed archaeological evidence of a lost, advanced Atlantic continent. There's evidence of a catastrophic sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, yes. There is evidence of ancient cities now underwater due to coastal shifts, sure. There is evidence of real historical collapses that felt sudden to the people living through them. Now that's solid ground. Everything beyond that is squarely hypothesis. And here's the key question we've been holding since this entire intro. If Atlantis was purely allegory, why does it feel like pattern recognition system? Why does it surface whenever civilization feels stretched thin? Because myths act like emotional barometers. They rise when anxiety rises. They remind us that permanence is an illusion. The final tension. And you don't need Atlantis to be physically real for it to be culturally real. The belief in its The belief in it shapes books, movies, research, expeditions, conspiracy communities, even political rhetoric. That makes it a living document, right? And living documents tell us more about the present than the past. Period. Send this to a friend who thinks Atlantis is ridiculous because secretly worries about grid failures and financial instability. And if you're a historian, archaeologist, or researcher who's navigating the space between skepticism and curiosity, let's talk. There's room for serious conversation without sliding into fantasy or dismissal. Because the legend of Atlantis isn't about finding ruins necessarily. It's about recognizing fragility. And the moment you recognize fragility, you start asking what holds things together. What holds them together? Which brings us to the part most people avoid. What, if anything, actually prevents collapse? We're not wrapping this up neatly. We're going to step forward. And the legend of Atlantis, what we do with the warning. And so here's where I'm going to leave it. Not with coordinates and not with a CGI reconstruction of a glowing underwater city, although there's some pictures in this video that you've seen, but with a tension. The legend of Atlantis has survived for over 2,000 years because it refuses to sit quietly in the past. Plato's Atlantis account may have been philosophical. It may have been political allegory. It may have been both. But the endurance of the story, that's not accidental. Empires have collapsed before, and that's historical fact. Complex systems have failed in ways that felt sudden to the people inside of them, and that's documented as well. Civilizations have believed they were untouchable, and of course, that's human nature. And the real power of Atlantis isn't that it sank. It's that it thought it couldn't. Now, let's be clear again. There's no confirmed physical evidence of a lost Atlantic supercontinent with advanced unknown technology. But there is evidence of catastrophic sea level rises after the Ice Age. There is evidence of ancient cities now submerged. There is evidence of systemic collapse throughout history. So we stand in that space honestly, okay? No hysteria, no dismissal, intellectual agnosticism. I hold this on many different theories. Because when you strip away the spectacle, the legend of Atlantis becomes something much more interesting than a treasure hunt. It becomes a question. Are we as stable as we think we are? Here's the part that matters right now. We live in a world that depends on invisible systems, digital infrastructure and energy grids, globalized supply chains, financial abstractions is a great way to put this. They work beautifully, right? Until they don't. Modern civilization doesn't collapse in stone. It collapses in code. That doesn't mean we're doomed, everyone. It just means fragility exists. And the ancient world understood fragility different than we do today. They encoded it in a story and in flood narratives and moral warnings, in cultural archetypes of destruction that remind each generation strength has become arrogance. Strength can become arrogance. And that's not preachy, that's pattern. And whether you interpret Atlantis through high strangeness in ancient history, through geology, through biblical threads, or through pure philosophy, the story lands because it mirrors a fear we don't like to articulate. That progress is not guaranteed. That dominance is temporary. That systems require maintenance. And that's moral, structural, relational. Atlantis is less about the ocean, folks. It's more about overconfidence. So what do we do with that? We pay attention. We ask better questions. We refuse to mock curiosity or worship fantasy. We build resilience instead of assuming permanence. And we stay intellectually honest. If this episode made you think, hit like, leave a review, just share it. That's not vanity. That's how this show grows. Word of mouth is the only real algorithm that matters long term. Folks, send this to a friend who says civilizations don't just disappear, and see what they say back. And if you're working seriously in the space, let me know. I'd love to work with you. Next Friday, we step deeper into the legend of Atlantis by zooming out even further, because Atlantis isn't the only drowned memory humanity carries. And once you start seeing that pattern, bottom line is you can't unsee it. Have a great day.
Stone towers touching the sky, gold in the water, power in their eyes, kings of the ocean.